Hi, everybody. My name is Keogh. I'm a research fellow at QUT in Brisbane. And in this talk, I just want to provide an overview of the research project I've been doing for the last 3 years, of which the workshop we're all at is the capstone event, as I mentioned in the welcome video, if you haven't seen that. And so in this talk, I want to kind of give an overview of the research I've been doing with Australian video game makers over the last 3 years, and just kind of look at some of the emerging themes and questions. It's going to be a fairly, you know, zoomed out overview of like a very large and wide reaching project. And looking at some of the videos that other presenters have been submitting to me, I think some of my broader questions and areas of interest are dived into really nicely by other people, which makes sense because it's for people whose research I've been reading for the last 3 years who are here. So without further ado, let's do that. So this project was called Formal, Informal, Embedded, Australian Game Developers and Skills Transfer. Um, for it, I interviewed over 200 game makers as well, 200 people, most of which were game makers, some of which were representatives of cultural institutions and government funding agencies and whatnot. Of those, about 150 were in Australia, and the rest were in Montreal, Netherlands, and Berlin. And I also did one each in Singapore and Indonesia this year via Zoom. I was hoping to do extensive Southeast Asian fieldwork, which was unable to happen because of 2020. I also ran a survey that 280 Australian game makers responded to. And yeah, and so the point of this project broadly was to complicate and expand understandings of just what video game development work looks like, or what video game development skills look like. Um, it was really driven and by feeling that kind of the industry statistics of how many jobs there are and how much money there is, um, wasn't telling the full story of, I guess, the lived experiences of the game makers I knew in Australia at the time, around 2017 when I was writing this out. And I really felt like we were just missing something, and I wanted to dive into what that was. And so tracking skills instead of jobs seemed like a really useful way to do that. And I guess for kind of a founding question of it, if not when I started, but definitely what's become the driving question, especially in the last year or so, as I try to turn this big body of data into some, actually useful publications, has really been what do we talk about when we talk about the video game industry as a site of production, as an object of study, as like something of a public imaginary, like what is the video game industry? And just as importantly, what isn't the video game industry? And this comes from a sense I have that there is a public, academic, policymaker perspective of the game industry as lucrative, as growing, as large scale, as able to bring a whole bunch of jobs and money into the economy, making more money than film. I'm sure we're all sick to death of hearing that one. That counts consoles but doesn't count television sales. Um, like just what's actually going on behind this framing. Um, and I think it's really worth mentioning that in undertaking this entire project, but also thinking through these questions in particular, I'm indebted to, by now, about a decade of discourse among game makers themselves, especially emerging independent game makers at the fringes of the industry, um, who have been debating what even is the video game industry and what does that concept allow parts of parts of game making to get away with, right? So Anna Anthropy's Rise of Video Game Zinsters is a hugely influential text on me, I believe. I really opened my eyes when I read it about 8 years ago now. And she really clearly just says that the industry gets away with the bad working conditions we all know because it's convinced people that the industry is the only place where video game production happens, which is, I think, a really fascinating observation, and one I'll probably dive into a bit more later. Likewise, game maker Robert Yang has a blog, "Lol, We're All Poor," and I won't go into in detail, but this was part of the broader, indie apocalypse discoverability discourse a few years back, and being like, well, why are we even trying to make money from doing this in the first place? Like, maybe we should try to make money from doing something else. Maybe we should find ways to live as game makers where we don't actually need to sustain ourselves doing it. And that raises all sorts of questions and debates that all of us are very familiar with, I think, around passion and unpaid labor versus commercialization. There's so much to unpack there. But there has been, my point here for years, for a very long time, this debate among game makers themselves about who is in the industry and who isn't in the industry, but also what is even the point of making video games in the first place? Is it commercial? Is it creative? Is it some weird tension between the two? Like what's going on here? And so these debates I think about are quite foundational to me, and like my desire to expand what sites, what subjectivities, what politics we account for when we talk about game making or game production as a cultural activity and a commercial activity. And and so in that vein, I guess, who do I think we're not talking about when we talk about the video game industry? What game making activity do I think we're missing? And importantly, it's not just hobbyists. I think there's a bunch of other stuff going on here. And so some examples from my field work from a range of backgrounds, I suppose. First, we have a team like House in Melbourne. Michael, I apologize for the old photo if you're watching this. So House, we all know today from Untitled Goose Game, one of the biggest games of the last few years, probably the biggest game with a bird in it since Flappy Bird or Crossy Road. There's a lot of bird games. It's a bit of a theme. But so House today are obviously in the video game industry. They made this massive commercial hit. It's on Nintendo, it's on Epic, it's everywhere. But like I've personally known for House guys for years when they were just four friends of mine in Melbourne who were just kind of entered the scene locally with some friends, were making games in their spare time around their studies and other work. And the industry, I think it's fair to say, was pretty unaware of them for quite a while. Though now they're just the poster boy every time industry lobby groups and representatives in Australia want to point out how successful the Australian game industry is, they point to House. But there was a long period of time which House were making games, but which were probably not easily imagined as the Australian video game industry. So like at what point does one enter the video game industry while they're making games? I think that's an interesting question. And then there's people like Megan, who I interviewed in Sydney. Megan, I'm not going to remember everything, but she's a composer, she's a music teacher, she's a game design teacher, she's a game journalist. Definitely does a lot of other things as well that I can't remember. But like this is very classic, like gig economy, creative worker kind of thing, where she just has a bunch of different activities. And she composed music for Wildfire, a Sydney-made indie game that's just come out on Switch this week, actually, if you're watching this as part of a workshop. And I interviewed Megan in a food court because she doesn't have an office, because most Australian game developers don't have offices. And she told me that like one of the main places she does her game development work is sitting on the floor of the gymnasium while her kids are doing acrobatics. That's where she does her game development. And at like the totally other end of this like creative commercial spectrum, I suppose, there's teams like Chaos Theory Games in Sydney, but many other companies similar to Chaos Theory throughout Australia who made a company because they wanted to make video games and then very quickly realized that doing that in a commercially sustainable way is almost impossible here, and realize that contract work for non-entertainment sector clients, so advertising games, training simulations, web design, or just anything else that uses their tech skills that pays, is a much more reliable source of income that maybe one day will lead to, enough of a war chest is the term I kept hearing, a war chest to then one day make their own intellectual property. But for now, the client work keeps them afloat. It's much more reliable but less creative. And so like there's all this kind of stuff that maybe doesn't fit in our traditional ideas of a game industry that I'm really fascinated by. So Australia was my research main fieldwork site, partly because I live here, and of course that's the game industry I know best and I'm most fascinated by. But I find, I'm not going to go into the whole history of how Australia's game industry ended here. I tried that the last time I recorded this talk and it took 20 minutes just to do this. But the really, really simple version is we used to have a lot of larger companies around the size of 50 people or so that were reliant on outsourcing work and work for hire contracts from primarily American publishers. Then the global financial crisis happened, and there was other things out there as well. This is a reductive narrative I'm telling right now, but Australian dollar, American dollar hit parity. It was no longer cheap to send work offshore to America. All those companies collapsed, just all of them. And the industry was obliterated here around 2008, just studio closure after studio closure. The workforce shrunk from about 1,500 down to 500, just like obliterated, absolutely obliterated. And what's happened since then is small scale development. I think the average Australian studio is now about 7 people, overly, well, both empowered by, but also dependent on um, foreign platforms, like in this platform economy. So Steam, the App Store, Unity, Unreal. We know the platform stuff. There's a whole session on it here, but like entirely reliant, so still reliant on offshore companies, but now not for employment, but for, just a platform through which to sell things and get some money. So of course there it's incredibly precarious. Lots of people don't have much money. We don't have the same investors as is available in, I think, North America and Western Europe. A lot of people are just pouring their own savings into the games and just hoping that it'll pay off eventually, that Nintendo will recognize them or a publisher will recognize them. And this situation of like forced independence. So in my survey, I think like 90% of respondents said they identify as either indie or independent. So this is fascinating to me because we often talk about, when we're focused on North America in particular, as like the mainstream and indie, like indie as this marginal fringe thing. And obviously that's been critiqued by a whole range of game studies academics, including many of which who are here. But in Australia, indie is mainstream. Indie is the mainstream mode of production. That is the dominant popular mode for which video games are made, which led me early in this process, in this project, to think like, well, who's the like indie of indie? Who's the fringe of indie when indie is mainstream? And I might get to that later. But I think of this like forced independence, or this way that indie is taken up almost like as an adventurous way to hide the extreme volatility of everyone's situation, as very similar to what Kate Oakley talks about with forced entrepreneurship, or just a recent book I've been reading of The Precarious by Russo, I think the last name is, I probably got that wrong. Just this way that extreme precarity, especially amongst creative workers, gets repackaged as an adventure, as, as independence, as autonomy. So it's very aspirational as well. And so Australia, I think, is, on the one hand, it is quite exemplary because of the particular history we have with the global industry. There's quite a large skill base, the obliteration of the industry, which has left a mark on the subjectivity of contemporary Australian game developers in a really fascinating way. But also, so Australia is exceptional in many ways in the global game industry, but is also quite exemplary at the same time of what the game industry is increasingly look like in more and more of the world, but which I think researchers and policymakers alike have kind of missed because of our fixation of the North American game industry or the Japanese game industry with these massive companies making the most visible games. But industry statistics all over the world, and this is from the GDC state of the industry survey of GDC attendees last year, I believe. More people There are more people in studios smaller than 10 than in 10 people than larger than 250 people, at least of people who attended GDC, which is maybe skewed. But in national industry reports I've seen over the last few years, the average studio size in many countries is lower than 10. Like, that's just normal. The dominant, most common mode in which video games are made in the world is in very small teams. And I feel like that is not well understood or imagined. That we imagine video game productions primarily happening in large campus-sized teams across 5 studios spread throughout the world. And of course, those games exist. So if you're especially interested from a political economy perspective, those games that make so much money are going to dominate your attention. But if you're interested in the experience of game makers, I think those large studios are kind of an exception. And the mode of video game production we see in Australia, I think, is much more common globally. Or at least that's how I try to convince non-Australians to read my recent academic publications. And also just when we look at the number of jobs or whatever, I don't feel like there's a sense of just how little money most of these companies operate on, just how aspirational they are, how much is just reliant on sweat equity and savings. This is from a report on Southeast Asian game development, but I don't think it's unique. I think you see it around the world. And so I've got this like, I feel like, and I feel like my data proves this, is that the video game industry is far more precarious than we often think it is. And I think, we look at like full-time equivalent jobs of a number of companies in a country, and I think it's kind of like this like movie studio Western town, right? Like just this flat shop front with nothing behind it. So like I had some very honest game developers talk to me about how sure they have a company and like it looks like they're a professional business, but like really they're just injecting personal money into this company for years on end for failed project after failed project. And by failed, I just mean not making money, not that it wasn't a good game. And then just hoping that one day one of these games will pay off and they can actually start paying themselves instead of being unpaid. And these are like company directors, right? These aren't the contractor a company hires. They are both at one time the employer, the company director, and also this absolutely precarious, self-enterprising um, bottom rung of a ladder, I suppose, of the Australian industry. Um, but I think this is common. I think just the fact that companies are kind of these shells that are used like this to do game make activity can hide the extreme levels of precarity felt by game makers. Um, and so we see, and I think this is common among much of the research we'll hear about this week, like we see this excessive self-exploitation of game makers, while in the exact same breath that they talk about that, talk about how fulfilling it is to be independent, to be autonomous, to not work at a large soulless studio, right? And I guess this is pretty common of the indie literature that we've been seeing for decades. And it was particularly interesting in Australia because of the way that Australian developers are quite political. And again, this is because of their history with the global game industry and with the large companies that screwed over a lot of Australian workers effectively even before the GFC. So they'll talk about how bad AAA is. They'll talk about issues of crunch, of unpaid overtime, of the issues of passion, like really explicitly. Like they're not dupes. They know these discourses. They're quite political, but they're still overworking. They're still underpaying themselves. They're still doing, as this participant, puts it, like they're still just crunching effectively, but they're crunching on something they own, and there's something that feels more autonomous or valuable for them out of that. And I like to compare that kind of response with something like this one, um, where this was a game developer who very much came from a background in other creative medium, and they kind of moved into games. And you could argue this is still a form of self-exploitation, but I think kind of like Robert Yang's blog earlier, it's just um, realistic, I suppose, of just surviving as a creative person under capitalism. They're like, they didn't quit their day job and start making games as a company as, the previous couple did. They just like started making games with no expectation of making money. And I would argue we're probably much better off mentally because of it. And then, we're just hoping one day it'll pay off, right? And like, is this self-exploitation? Is it self-exploitation to make games and not expect to be paid money in this manner, in the same way that the previous one with about crunching? And I think that's a really difficult thing to figure out about like tension between creative ambition and commercial need, like the art commerce tension, which is just fundamental to cultural industries in a way that I don't think we talk about much in games beyond, the passion unpaid labor kind of issue, which of course is important. And of course, there's people at the other end of the spectrum, right, who aren't willing to give up their financial security to do something creative, but who are willing to make creative sacrifices to make their business more sustainable. And these were the embedded game developers, I suppose, the ones doing client work because it was more reliable, but often found it to be like a carrot on a string, right, where they never could get out of client work. They wanted to make their own games, but could never make their way back there. But at least they had a day job, right? That was a bit more reliable and a bit less crunchy for them than some other indie developers. And so I guess this is kind of like a how it started, how it's going meme, which seems timely at the moment. But so the original plan was a way to trace this like nebulous range of identities and activities was like there are formal game developers, there are informal game developers, and there are embedded game developers. Where informal I took from Ramon Lobato and Julian Thomas's Informal Media Economies, which is a really great book. Highly recommend it. And Embedded I took from Stuart Cunningham um, and various collaborators' works on The Creative Trident, which looks at creative work in the creative industries, non-creative work in the creative industries, and creative work in the non-creative industries. And so I was interested in, well, who are the creative working game developers embedded in other industries? That's kind of where it started. And of course, this plan fell apart when it confronted reality and my empirical research. Well, like you can still see all these, and it's still a useful framing device, I think, for my research. But the formal and the informal are just so much more meshed up than I anticipated. That it's not, there are people working in companies, and then there are hobbyists and students. There are students who have made companies. There are hobbyists who have registered companies so they can put their stuff on the App Store or access funding. There are formal companies where people make stuff on the side, and then that accidentally becomes their company's game. When it goes viral on the internet, the company goes, oh, well, the company, by which I mean their mates, go, oh, well, let's work on that instead. In this very gig economy, portfolio career enterprise of the self way, right? And the embedded stuff is complicated too, because their companies are still independent game development companies, as far as they're concerned, who spend most of their time contracting, making stuff that is not creatively fulfilling, but would like to find a way back to do the original IP, but without screwing themselves over labor-wise. So like, it's much more complex. It's more nebulous than just we can't pigeonhole the actual developers themselves, right? It's more the types of activity that they shift between. And so what I've kind of like led towards now is thinking more about how can we move away from talking about the video game industry and talking about the video game field, very much in a Pierre Bourdieu field of cultural production way. And I feel like at current, I still haven't got my head around Bordeaux enough to do it like theoretical justice, but I find it a really valuable way to think about the tensions and issues between creativity, commercial necessity, well, essentially those two, right? To think about those in a much more nuanced way that does not reduce it on one hand to self-exploitation and to these duped apolitical game makers, which they're not, but also doesn't reduce it to this celebratory neoliberal dream of like individualized entrepreneurial autonomy. I think it instead is able to track the struggles and the dynamics between over contested cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital in a way that I think we've seen playing out in video game development discourses for over a decade now, especially around the Twine game scene in the early 2010s, with who is now visible at GDC on Twitter as a game developer who was not once visible. And a big part of this project that I just do not have time to get into is I took a page from Adrian Shaw's book and just asked people, do you identify as a video game developer? Do you identify as part of the video game industry? And the answers to that were absolutely fascinating. And we can talk about that on Discord if you want. So I find the field, that second dot point there, I won't read it out now, but a field is who gets to decide who is part of the field in this interesting cyclical way. And historically, the video game industry has been able to define itself as the entire video game field. And what we have now, I think, with how the video game industry has been disrupted, dare I use that word, is the broader field has come into, we can now see it in a way we couldn't before. We can now see that the video game industry is a tiny circle, and there's a much bigger circle around that, which is the field of video game production. And how do these relate? What's going on there? And so I guess I'm really interested in, instead of formal and informal, the intense informalization with an obnoxious backslash of these two fields in a way that like connects together with discourse or debates that have been going on in broader creative labor, cultural studies kind of discourse for ages now, around like creativity, around the entreprecariat, literature that finds this very unstable, volatile, precarious creative work utterly exploitative and endemic of everything that's wrong with contemporary capitalism, but also with like the potential of moving beyond like the wage labor relationship in some possibly really promising, but also unlikely, perhaps, ways. Um, and I think you see this in Australia, where like the game developers are so much more articulately political. They'll talk about neoliberalism, they'll talk about capitalism, they'll talk about unions, in a way that most of the literature says creative workers don't, that they're all apolitical or whatever. But you see that in Australia a lot, and I think you see it increasingly around the world a lot. Um, but because, so I went into this thinking, oh, the game industry is so much more progressive now than before the crash in Australia. And I posed that to this game developer who quite rightly pointed out that who gets to take the risks in the risky, creative, precarious. And often it's for people who have the most safety nets. And because of that, it means if you need maternity leave, most Australian companies can't offer you maternity leave. Like all their employees are, on part-time contracts. So there is no maternity leave. So already you're just excluding women, never mind people even more marginal than women, right? Um, so like this person was particularly complaining about the lack of period leave, but then went on like, we don't even have maternity leave in most of our companies, right? So no one's getting superannuation when they're working on these fixed term contract arrangements. And of course, some people are, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of people aren't. So the progressive politics people are to talk about, because EA is not going to fire them because EA is not hiring them, still butts up against the realities of being precarious and who has access to that. And as a final point of this is, even those who are maybe more privileged to be able to undertake this kind of independent, risky, creative work can't do it forever. Um, I asked my interviewees, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And the most persistent response was, I have absolutely no idea. Actually, the most persistent response was just laughing when I asked that question. And this was like my favorite response to this question, and is also exemplary of like the 200 odd responses I got, where just like, it all depends on the current project. I can't make any plans for the future, and not even 20 years in the future, literally 1 year in the future, until I know how this game goes. And I can't know how this game goes. It doesn't matter how viral my tweets went. It doesn't matter how good I know the game is. Like the discoverability question, the which live streamer decides to play it question, whether or not Nintendo flips a coin and puts it on the front page question. Just, they have no idea of how it's going to go, right? And maybe next year they won't be able to work in games at all. Maybe next year, or maybe for the next 5 years, they're suddenly working on a live game because the game went so well and players are demanding content. It's just so volatile, and people get exhausted of this and they just leave. Um, there are no, so like AAA is also highly unsustainable. We've seen that. Ergine's talking about it this week, and many people have talked about it in the past in various ways. But in AAA, you have like, at least you have like promotion pathways. You can be a junior designer, then you can be a senior designer, then you can be a creative director. When you're just making a game with your 4 friends and there's no scale to grow your company, there's also no scale to be promoted, to one day be paid more money than you're being paid now. Either you become a billionaire or you quit. These are like the only 2 options, which of course is the same as most creative endeavors, but I don't think we have yet come to terms with the fact that games are exactly the same as every other creative endeavor in that respect. That we have not yet found the career pathways that allows people to do this for more than 5 or 10 years, both in AAA, but especially outside of AAA. And just to really stress that point, this is the age range of of the 280 developers who filled out my survey. And I think it's incredibly telling. And IGDA satisfaction surveys, developer satisfaction surveys often tell a very similar story globally. And in recent stats from the IGEA here in Australia, over half of all companies that responded to their survey was less than 5 years old in 2019, and 25%, it's like a quarter of all companies, were still working on their first game. And one way you could argue that is, oh great, the video game industry in Australia is growing. That's absolutely one possibility. I'm much more wary and skeptical, and think it points to the rapid, perpetual turnover of staff and businesses that is preventing the Australian game industry from retaining talent. And similarly, I think preventing most game industries around the world from retaining talent, because people don't know how to make it work sustainably. And finally, this was another response um, to where do you see yourself in 5 years. This developer thought about it for a while and kind of just got frustrated and just really like they don't care. They just want to get better and make cool stuff. That's all they're doing. And I just love this response. It's stuck with me for ages. It's on my whiteboard in my office right above me. Actually, I wrote it there when I came back from fieldwork 2 years ago. Um, where on the one hand, it perfectly captures that precarious portfolio career, enterprise of the self, realities of doing creative work in a sector without any jobs where you have to survive on yourself increasingly in a very individualized way. Um, but it also speaks to the fundamentally this non-commercial drivers of most of the people in this field. And I think that's something we need to negotiate as researchers. How do we negotiate all the issues of contemporary neoliberal capitalism that, as McRobbie says, and I'm paraphrasing, like pushes young people into fields that are um, volatile and unstable, you know, from the beginning. How do we deal with that alongside the fundamental reality that most of these people are pursuing game development because they want to undertake a creative craft? And I think that tension is worth spending more time on and taking seriously rather than just saying we're all suckers, because I don't think they are all suckers. But likewise, I think they are all being exploited. So that's like a pretty broad overview of a lot of things I've been doing. There's much more I haven't talked about here as well, which we can get into in Discord. Some stuff I'm interested in exploring from this research into the future. There's still many more publications to be had. Just still so many interviews I have to transcribe, which I don't want to think about. But just what even do sustainable game making careers look like? Or what can they look like in the absence of stable employment at large companies? And we haven't figured out how to structure a game development industry at a national or local level that doesn't rely on the large companies that are decreasingly normal in the game industry. Um, and so what does solidarity look like when everyone is indie, when everyone's in these individualized situations? What are the alternative methods of building collectivity in terms of building solidarity? And we have a couple of papers about the Game Workers Unite movement this week, which I think will dive into that quite nicely. And I guess I said this in my welcome video, what does it mean to treat video game production seriously as a cultural industry? Um, like, what does it mean to treat the actual, like not just as an industry, but as a cultural industry, as underpinned by the production of texts for cultural, creative, symbolic reasons, where most people will never make any money and toil away in anonymity, and some people will make money. How can we not just talk about the people who do make money? And I guess related to that is how can we account for how the video game industry emerges from the broader video game field in specific local contexts? And this is something I'm particularly fascinated by, is that the industry doesn't just parachute a AAA company into a town and go, bam, the game industry's here now. But I think that's how we often think the game industry works. We'll attract the game industry as opposed to we'll grow the game industry. And I think this is important for policymakers at national levels, at state levels, as important for game developers, and it's important for researchers, is how does the game industry emerge from the video game field in a local context, not just how does the game industry parachute in the video game field, because that's not how it works. Yeah. And final slide, these are just some of the main publications to have come out of this research so far. There's others, and we can talk about in Discord, but these are probably the main three that touch on the stuff I talked about here. And I can get you copies of these if you need them. That's about it. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the week.